Chapter 6 of the Upas Tree by Florence L. Barclay. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. Chapter 6. Aubrey puts his foot down. Ronnie's first sensation as he returned to consciousness was of extreme lassitude and exhaustion. His eyelids lifted heavily. He had some difficulty in realizing where he was. Then he saw his 'cello, leaning against a chair, and, a moment later, Aubrey Treherne lying back in the seat opposite, enveloped in a cloud of tobacco smoke. "Hullo, West," said Aubrey kindly. "You've put in your half hour quite unexpectedly. You were trying, in a sleepy fashion, to tell me how you came to purchase this fine 'cello, but you dropped off with the tale unfinished." Ronnie looked in silence at his wife's cousin. "Are you the better for your sleep?" "I'm fagged out," said Ronnie wearily. Aubrey went to a cupboard, poured something into a glass, and handed it to Ronald. "Drink this, my boy. It will soon wake you up." Ronnie drank it. Its tint was golden, its odour fragrant, but otherwise, for aught he knew, it might have been pure water. He sat up and took careful note of his surroundings. Then an idea seemed to strike him. He leaned forward and twanged the strings of his 'cello. They were not in tune. "Will you lend me your tuning fork?" he said to Aubrey. But Aubrey had expected this. "Sorry," he said. "I don't possess one, just now. I gave away mine last week. You can tune your 'cello by the organ." "I don't know how to tune a 'cello," said Ronnie. "Let me show you," suggested Aubrey, with the utmost friendliness. He walked over to the organ, drew out the 'cello stop, sounded a note, then came back humming it. Then he took up the Infant and carefully tuned the 4 strings, talking easily meanwhile. "You see, you screw up the pegs, so. The notes are A, D, G, C." "What have you done to your lip?" said Ronald suddenly. "Knocked it on the stove just now as I bent to stoke it with my fingers for fear of waking you. It bled amazingly." Aubrey produced a much-stained handkerchief. "It's curious how a tiny knock will sometimes draw as much blood as a sword thrust. There! The Infant is in perfect tune, so far as I can tell without the bow. Do you mind if I just pass the bow across the strings? After each string is perfectly tuned to a piano or organ, you must make them vibrate together in order to get the fifths perfect. A violin or a 'cello is capable of a more complete condition of intuneness, if I may coin a word, than an organ or a piano." He took the bow, then with careful precision sounded the strings, singly and together. The beautiful open notes of the Infant of Prague filled the room. "There!" said Aubrey, putting it back against the empty chair. "I am afraid that is all I must attempt. I only play the fiddle. I might disappoint you in your Infant if I did more than sound the open strings." Ronald passed his hand over his forehead. "When did I fall asleep?" he asked. "Just after suggesting that we should not discuss your books, or your public." "Ah, I remember. Treherne, I have had the most vivid and horrible nightmares." "Then forget them," put in Aubrey quickly. "Never recount a nightmare, when it is over. You suffer its horrors again, in the telling. Turn your thoughts to something pleasant. When do you reach England?" "I cross by the Hook the day after tomorrow, reaching London early the following morning. I shall go to my club, see my publisher, lunch in town, and get home to tea." "To the moated Grange?" inquired Aubrey. "Yes, to the Grange. Helen will await me there. But why do you call it moated? We do not boast a moat." Aubrey laughed. "I suppose my thoughts had run to MaryAnn. You remember, 'He cometh not,' she said. The young woman who grew tired of waiting. They do, sometimes, you know. I believe her Grange was moated. All Granges should be moated, just as all old manors should be haunted. What a jolly time you and Helen must have had in that lovely old place. I knew it well as a boy." "You must come and stay with us," said Ronnie, with an effort. "Thanks, dear chap. Delighted. Has Helen kept well in your absence?" "Quite well. She wrote as often as she could, but there was a beastly long time when I could get no letters. Hullo! I say!" Ronnie stood up suddenly, the light of remembrance on his thin face, and began plunging his hands into the many pockets of his Norfolk coat. "I found a letter from Helen at the Poste Restante, here, but owing to my absorption in the Infant, I clean forgot to read it. Heaven send I haven't dropped it anywhere." He stood with his back to the stove, hunting vaguely, but feverishly, in all his pockets. Aubrey smoked on. watching him without stirring. Aubrey was wishing that Helen could know how long her letter had remained unread, owing to the Infant of Prague. At length Ronnie found the letter, a large, square foreign envelope, safely stowed away in his pocket-book, in the inner breast pocket of his coat. "Of course," he said. "I remember. I put it there when I was writing Zimmermann's cheque. You will excuse me if I read it straight away. There may be something requiring a wire." "Naturally, my dear fellow. Read it. Cousins need not stand on ceremony, and the Infant now being thoroughly in tune, your mind is free to spare a thought or two to Helen. Don't delay another moment. There may be a message in the letter for me." Ronnie drew the thin sheets from the envelope in feverish haste. As he did so, a folded note fell from among them, unseen by Ronnie, and dropped to the floor close to Aubrey's foot. Ronnie began reading, but black spots danced before his eyes, and Helen's beautiful clear writing zigzagged up and down the page. Presently his vision cleared a little, and he read more easily. Suddenly he laughed a short, rather mirthless laugh. "What's up?" inquired Aubrey Treherne. "Oh, nothing much. Only I suppose I'm in for a lecture again. Helen says, 'Ronald.'" Ronnie lifted his eyes from the paper. "What a nuisance it is to own that kind of a name! As a small boy I was always Ronnie when people were pleased, and Ronald if I was in for a wigging. The feeling of it sticks to you all your life." "Of course it does," said Aubrey sympathetically. "Beastly hard lines. Well, Helen says Ronald." Ronnie's eyes sought the paper again, but once more the black spots danced in a wild shower. He rubbed his eyes and went on reading. "Ronald, I shall have something to tell you when you get home, which will make a great difference to this Christmas, and to all Christmases to come. I will not put it in a letter. I will wait until you are here, and I can say it." "What can it be?" questioned Aubrey. "Oh, I know," said Ronnie, unsteadily. The floor was becoming soft and sandy again. "I have heard it all before. She always thinks me extravagant at Christmas, and objects to her old people being given champagne and other seasonable good things. I have heard it, all before. There was no need to write about it. And when she says it, I shall jolly well tell her that a fellow can do as he likes with his own earnings." "I should," said Aubrey Treherne. Ronald went on reading, in silence. Aubrey's eye was upon the folded sheet of paper on the floor. Suddenly Ronnie said, "Hello! I'm to have it after all. Listen to this. P.S. On second thoughts, now you are so nearly home, I would rather you knew what I have to say before you return. So I'm enclosing with this a pencil note I wrote some weeks ago. Ronnie, we will have a Christmas tree this Christmas." "Well, I never," said Ronnie. "That's not a very wild thing in the way of extravagance, is it? But it's a concession. I have wanted a Christmas tree each Christmas, but Helen said you couldn't have a Christmas tree in a home where there were no kids. It was absurd for two grown-up people to give each other a Christmas tree. Now, where is—" He began searching in the empty envelope. With a quick, stealthy movement, Aubrey put his foot upon the note. "It's not here," said Ronnie, shaking out the thin sheets one by one, and tearing open the envelope. "She has forgotten it, after all. Well, I should think it will keep. It can hardly have been important." "Evidently," remarked Aubrey. "Third thoughts follow second thoughts. Even Helen would scarcely put a lecture on economy into a welcome home letter." "No, of course not," agreed Ronnie, and walked unsteadily to his chair. Aubrey, stooping, transferred the note from beneath his foot to his pocket. Ronald read his letter through again, then turned to Aubrey. "Look here," he said. "I must send a wire. Helen wants to know whether I wish her to meet me in town, or whether I would rather she waited for me at home. What shall I say?" Aubrey Treherne rose. "Think it over," he said, "while I fetch a form." He left the room. He was some time in finding that form. When he returned his face was livid, his hand shook. Ronald sat in absorbed contemplation of the Infant. "It appears more perfect every time one sees it," he remarked, without looking at Aubrey. Aubrey handed him a form for foreign telegrams, and a fountain pen. "What are you going to say to your wife?" he asked in a low voice. "I don't know," said Ronnie, vaguely. "What a jolly pen! What am I to do with this?" "You are to let Helen know whether she is to meet you in town or wait at the Grange." Ah, I remember. What do you advise, Treherne? I don't seem able to make plans." "I should say most decidedly let her wait for you at home." "Yes, I think so too. I shall be rushing around in town. I can get home before tea time. How shall I word it?" "Why not say, 'Owing to satisfactory news in letter, prefer to meet you quietly at home. All well.'" Ronnie wrote this at Aubrey's dictation. Then he paused. "What news?" he asked, perplexed at the words he himself had written. "Why, that Helen is quite well. Isn't that satisfactory news?" "Oh, of course. I see. Yes." "Then you might add, 'Will wire train from London.'" "But I know the train now," objected Ronnie. "I have been thinking of it for weeks. I shall catch the 3 o'clock express." "Very well. Then add, 'Coming by 3 o'clock train, home to tea.'" Ronnie wrote it, a joyous smile on his lips and in his eyes. "It sounds so near," he said. "After 7 long months, it sounds so near." "Now," said Aubrey, "give it to me. I will take it out for you. I know an office where one can hand in wires at any hour." "You are a good fellow," said Ronnie gratefully. "And now look here," continued Aubrey. "Before I go, you must turn into bed, old chap. You need sleep more than you know. I can do a little prescribing myself. I am going to give you a dose of sleeping stuff, which brought me merciful oblivion after long nights of maddening wakefulness. You will feel another man when you wake in the morning. But I am coming with you to the Hague. I can tend the Infant while you go to the publishers. I will see you safely on board at the Hook, on the following evening, and next day you will be at home. After all those months alone in the long grass, you don't want any more solitary travelling. Now come to bed." Ronnie rose unsteadily. "Aubrey," he said, "you are a most awfully good fellow. I shall tell Helen. She will be so grateful. I'm perfectly all right, you know, but other people seem so busy and so vague. You will help me to arrest their attention. I must take the Infant to bed." "Yes, yes," said Aubrey. "We will find a cosy place for the Infant. If Helen were here she would provide a bassinet. Don't forget that joke. It will amuse Helen. I make you a present of it. If Helen were here she would provide a bassinet and a pram for the Infant of Prague." Ronnie laughed. "I shall tell Helen you said so." Then, carrying the 'cello, he lurched unsteadily through the doorway. The Infant's head had a narrow escape. Aubrey Treherne sent off the telegram. He required to alter only one word. When it reached Helen the next morning at breakfast, it read thus: "Owing to astonishing news in letter, prefer to meet you quietly at home. All well, coming by 3 o'clock train. Home to tea. Ronald." Helen suffered a sharp pang of disappointment. She had expected something quite different. The adjective "astonishing" seemed strangely cold and unlike Ronnie. She had thought he would say "wonderful," or "unbelievable," or "glorious." But before she had finished her first cup of coffee she had reasoned herself back into complete content. Ronnie, in an unusual fit of thoughtfulness, had remembered her feeling about the publicity of telegrams. She had so often scolded him for putting "darling" and "best of love" into messages which all had to be shouted by telephone from the postal town into the little village office which, being also the village grocery store, was a favourite rendezvous at all hours of the day for village gossips. It was quite unusually considerate of Ronnie to curb the glowing words he must have longed to pour forth. The very effort of that curbing had reduced him to a somewhat stilted adjective. So Helen finished her lonely breakfast with thoughts of glad anticipation. Ronnie's return was drawing so near. Only 2 more breakfasts without him. At the third she would be pouring out his coffee, and hearing him comment on the excellence of Blake's hot buttered toast. Then, with a happy heart, she went up to the nursery. Yet, unconsciously, the pang remained. Chapter 7 of the Upas Tree by Florence L. Barclay. MaryAnn. Chapter 7. A Friend in Need. As Aubrey Treherne, on his way back from dispatching the telegram, stood in the general entrance hall, fumbling with the latch-key at the door of his own flat, a tall young man in an ulster dashed up the wide stone stairs, rapidly read the names on the various brass plates, and arrived at Aubrey's just as his door had yielded to persuasion and was admitting him into his own small passage. "Hello," said a very British voice. "Do you happen to be Ronald West's wife's cousin?" Aubrey turned in the doorway, taking stock of his interlocutor. He saw a well-knit, youthful figure, a keen, resourceful face, and a pair of exceedingly bright brown eyes, unwavering in the steady penetration of their regard. Already they had taken him in, from top to toe, and were looking past him in a rapid investigation of as much of his flat as could be seen from the doorway. Aubrey was caught. He had fully intended muffling his electric bell, and not being at home to visitors. But this brisk young man, with an atmosphere about him of always being 10 minutes ahead of time, already had one of his very muddy boots inside the door, and eagerly awaited the answer to his question. So it was useless to reply to the latter in German, and to bang the former. "Therefore, I have that honour," replied Aubrey, with the best grace he could muster. "Ah, well, I am sorry to bother you so late, but I must have a word with you, and then I am going round to spend the night with Ronnie at his hotel." "Come in," said Aubrey, in a low voice. "But we must not talk in the passage, or we shall wake him. I saw he was not fit to be alone, so I sent to the hotel for his traps, and am putting him up here. He turned in, half an hour ago, and seemed really inclined to sleep. He was almost off when I left him." Aubrey, closing the door, led the way to his sitting-room, where the 3 easy-chairs were still drawn up before the stove. "I conclude you are Dr. Cameron?" said Aubrey, turning up the light and motioning his visitor to the chair which had lately been Ronnie's. "Yes, I am Dick Cameron, Ronnie's particular chum. And if he ever needed a particular chum, poor old chap, he does so at this moment. But I am glad he has found a friend in you, and one really able to undertake him. You did right not to leave him at the hotel. He must not travel back to England alone." "I have already arranged to accompany him," said Aubrey Treherne. "Good! It will save me a journey." Dick pulled off his ulster, threw it across the red velvet sofa, flung his cap after it, and took the proffered chair. In his blue serge suit and grey tie, he looked like the captain of a college football team. Aubrey, eyeing him with considerable reserve and distaste, silently took up his position in the chair opposite. He felt many years older than this peremptory young man, who appeared to consider himself master of all situations. Dick turned his bright eyes upon the empty chair between them. "So Ronnie has spent the evening with you?" "He has." "Who was the third party?" "The third party was the Infant of Prague." "Oh, bother that rotten Infant!" exclaimed Dr. Dick. "I came near to putting my foot through its shining tummy this morning. Still, it may serve its silly use, if it takes his mind off his book, until we can get him safely home. I suppose you know, sir, that Ronald West is about as ill as a man can be. It will be touch and go whether we can get him home before the crash comes." "I thought he seemed excited and unwell," said Aubrey. "What do you consider is the cause of his condition?" "Well, the bother is, we can't exactly tell. But I should say he's been letting himself in for constant exposure to extreme heat by day, and to swampy dampness by night, not taking proper food, living in a whirl of excited imagination with no rational companionship to form an outlet, and, on top of all this, contracted some malarial germ, which has put up his temperature and destroyed the power of natural sleep. This condition of brain has enabled him to work practically night and day at his manuscript, and I have no doubt he has written brilliant stuff, which an enchanted world will read by and by, with no notion of the price which has been paid for their pleasure and edification. But meanwhile, unless proper steps are taken to avert disaster, our friend Ronnie will be, by then, unable to understand or enjoy his triumph." Aubrey's lean face flushed. "I hope you are taking an exaggerated view," he said. "I hope you understand," retorted Dr. Dick, "that I am doing nothing of the kind. I cannot tell you precisely what course the illness will run. The nuisance of these African jungle poisons is that we know precious little about them. But I have known Ronnie since he and I were at school together, and any poison goes straight to his brain. If he gets influenza, he never sneezes and sniffles like an ordinary mortal, but walks about, more or less light-headed, all day, and lies dry awake staring at the ceiling all night." "What do you recommend in this case?" "Ah, there we arrive at my reasoning for coming to you. I don't know Ronnie's wife. I conclude you do. She is my first cousin. I have known her intimately all her life. Can you write to her tonight, and mail the letter so it will reach her before he arrives home?" "I have every intention of doing so." Dick Cameron sat forward eagerly. "Good! It will come better from you than from a total stranger. No doubt I am known to her by name, but we have never chanced to meet. Without alarming her too much, I want you to make Ronnie's condition quite clear to her. Tell her he must be kept absolutely quiet and happy on his return, and, with as little delay as may be, she must have the best advice procurable." "Whom would you recommend?" "To be quite honest, I'm afraid a brain specialist. But I will give you the name of a man who has also made a special study of the conditions caused by malarial fever and exposure to tropical heat." Dick produced a note-book, wrote down a name and address, tore out the leaf and handed it to Aubrey. "There, you can't do better than that. Of course it is everything that you are taking him right home, but, even so, let your letter get there first. You might have difficulty in seeing Mrs. West alone, and mischief might be done in a moment, which you would be powerless to prevent. Tell her that above all else she must avoid any sort of shock for him. A violent emotion of any kind would probably send him clean off his head." "I'm sure you are right there," said Aubrey. "He suddenly became violent tonight, while we were talking about his 'cello, got up, staggered across, and struck me on the mouth." Dr. Dick's keen eyes were instantly bent upon Aubrey Treherne in perplexed scrutiny. Aubrey shifted uncomfortably in his seat, then rose and put fuel into the stove. Still Dick sat silent. When Aubrey resumed his seat, Dick spoke, slowly, as if carefully weighing each word. "Now that is peculiar," he said. "Ronnie's mental condition is a perfectly amiable one, unless anything was said or done to cause him extreme provocation. In fact, he would not be easily provoked. He is inclined rather to take a maudlinly affectionate and friendly view of things and people. To be said very simply, almost childishly pleased with the last new idea. That wretched infant of his is a case in point. I should be glad if you would tell me, sir, what happened in this room just before Ronnie hit out." "Merely a conversation about the 'cello," replied Aubrey, hurriedly. "A perfectly simple remark of mine apparently annoyed him, but I soon pacified him. He was obviously not responsible for his actions." "He was obviously in a frenzy of rage," remarked Dr. Dick, dryly, "and he caught you a good one in the mouth. Did he apologize afterwards?" "He fell asleep," said Aubrey, "and appeared on wakening to have absolutely forgotten the occurrence." Dick got up, put his hands in his pocket, walked over to the organ, and, bending down, examined the stops. He whistled softly to himself as he did so. Aubrey, meanwhile, had the uncomfortable sensation that the whole scene with Ronnie was being reenacted, with Dick Cameron as an interested spectator. It tried Aubrey's nerves. "I do not wish to hurry you," he suggested presently, "but if I am to post my letter to my cousin before midnight, the sooner I am able to write it, the better." Dick turned at once and took up his ulster. Aubrey, relieved, came forward cordially to lend him a hand. "No, thank you," said Dr. Dick. "A man should always get into his coat unaided. In so doing he uses certain muscles which are exercised in no other way." He swung himself into the heavy coat and stood before Aubrey Treherne, very tall, very grave, very determined. "You quite understand, sir, that if you were not yourself taking Ronnie home, I should do so. And if, by any chance, you are prevented from going, just let me know, and I can be packed and ready to start home with him in a quarter of an hour." "Very good of you," said Aubrey. "But all our plans are made. We reach the Hague to-morrow night. He requires a day there for making his translation and publishing arrangements, so we sleep at the Hague to-morrow, crossing by the Hook of Holland on the following evening. I've wired to the Hotel des Indes for a suite. I felt sure my cousin would wish him to have the best of everything, and to be absolutely comfortable and quiet. At the Hotel des Indes they have an excellent orchestra, and a particularly fine cellist. West will enjoy showing him the infant. They can compare babies. It will keep him amused and interested all the evening." "Good idea," agreed Dr. Dick. But Ronnie need not come down on his wife for his hotel expenses. He is making a pot of money himself now. You will be careful to report to Mrs. West exactly what I have said of his condition?" "I will write immediately. And we stay a night en route, and another is taken up in crossing. My cousin should receive my letter 24 hours before our arrival." "Impress upon her," said Dr. Dick earnestly, "how dangerous any mental shock might be." "Do you fear brain fever?" questioned Aubrey. Dick laughed. "Brain fever is a popular fiction," he said. "It is not a term admitted by the faculty. If you mean meningitis, no, I trust not. But probably temporary loss of memory, and a complete upsetting of mental control, with a possible impairing, for a considerable time, of his brilliant mental powers. In other words, my cousin's husband is threatened with insanity." "Lord, no!" exclaimed Dick with vehemence. "How easily you good people hand a fellow creature over to that darkest of all fates! Ronnie's condition is brought about by temporary circumstances which are not in the least likely to have permanent results. He has always had the eccentricity of genius, but since his genius has been recognized, people have ceased to consider him eccentric. Now I must be off, but I will see him first. Will you show me his room?" "He is asleep," objected Aubrey. "Is it not a pity to disturb him?" "I doubt his being asleep," replied Dick. "But if he is, we shall not wake him." He stepped into the passage, his attitude one of uncompromising determination. Aubrey Treherne opened the door of Ronnie's room. It was in darkness. He stepped back into the passage, lighted a candle, handed it to Dick Cameron, and they entered quietly together. Ronnie lay on his back, sleeping heavily. His eyes were partly open, his face flushed, his breathing rapid. One arm was flung out toward a chair beside the bed, on which lay his pocket book, his watch, and a small leather miniature case containing a portrait of Helen. This lay open upon the watch, having evidently fallen from his fingers. A candle had burned down into the socket and sputtered itself out. Dick picked up the miniature, held it close to the light of his own candle, and examined it critically. "He certainly went in for beauty," he remarked in a low voice to Aubrey Treherne, as he laid the miniature beside the pocket book. "Of course Ronnie would. But it is also a noble face, a face one could altogether trust. Ronnie will be in safe hands once you get him home." Aubrey's smile, in the flare of the candle, was the grin of a hungry wolf. He made no reply. Dr. Dick, watch in hand, stood silently beside the bed, counting the rapid respiration of his friend. Then he turned, took up an empty tumbler from the table beside him, smelt it, and looked at Aubrey Treherne. "I thought so," he said. "You meant well, no doubt, but don't do it again. Drugs to produce sleep may occasionally be necessary, but should only be given under careful medical supervision. Personally, I am inclined to think that any sort of artificial sleep does more harm to a delicately poised brain than insomnia. However, opinions differ. But there is no question that your experiment of tonight must not be repeated. I have given him stuff to take during his homeward journey which will tend to calm him, lessen the fever, and clear his mind. See that he takes it." Young Dick Cameron walked out of Ronnie's room, blew out the candle he carried, and replaced the candlestick on a little ornamental bracket. Aubrey followed, inwardly fuming. If Dick had been at the top of the tree, the first opinion procurable from Harley Street West, his manner could hardly have been more authoritative, his instructions more peremptory. "Upstart," said Aubrey to himself. "Insolent jackanapes." When Dick Cameron reached the outer door his cap was on the back of his head. His hands were thrust deep into his coat pockets. "Good evening," he said. "Excuse my long intrusion. I shall be immensely obliged if you will let me have a wire reporting your safe arrival, and a letter later on, with details as to Ronnie's state. I put my address on the paper I gave you just now, with the name of the man Mrs. West must call in." Dick crossed the great entrance hall and ran lightly down the stone steps. Aubrey heard the street door close behind him. Then he shut it and double-locked his own flat. "Upstart," he said. "Jackanapes! Insolent fool!" It is sometimes consoling to call people that which you know they are not, yet heartily wish they were. Aubrey entered his sitting-room. He wanted an immediate vent for his ill-humour and sense of impotent mortification. The leaf from Dick's note-book lay on the table. Aubrey took it up, opened the iron door of the stove, and thrust the leaf into the very heart of the fire. Chapter 7. Upas Tree by Florence L. Barclay. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. Chapter 8. Paradise Lost. Aubrey Treherne sat at his writing table, his head buried in his hands. Before him lay the closely written sheets of his letter to Helen, beside them her pencil note which had fallen, unnoticed by Ronnie, from her letter to him. Presently Aubrey lifted his head. His face bore traces of the anguish of soul through which he had been passing. A man who has yielded himself to unrestrained wrong-doing suffers with a sharpness of cold misery unknown to the brave, true heart, however hard or lonely may be his honourable way. Before reading his own letter to Helen, Aubrey read again her pathetic note to her husband. Ronnie, my own, excuse pencil and bad writing. Nurse has propped me up in bed, but not so high as I should like. Darling, I am not ill, only rather weak, and very, very happy. Ronnie, I must write to you on this first day of being allowed a pencil, though I shall not, of course, yet send the letter. In fact, I dare say I shall keep it and give it to you by and by, but you will like to feel that I wrote at once. Darling, how shall I tell you? Beside me, in your empty place, as I write, lies your little son, our own baby boy, Ronnie. He came 3 days ago. Oh, Ronnie, it is so wonderful. He is so like you, though his tiny fingers are all pink and crinkled, and his palms are like little seashells. But he is going to have your artistic hands. When I cuddle them against my neck, the awful longing and loneliness of these past months seems wiped out, but only because he is yours, darling, and because I know you are soon coming back to him and to me. I could not tell you before you went, because I know you would have felt obliged to give up going, and your book is so important. And I have not told you since, because you must not have anything to worry you while so far away. Also, I was glad to bear it alone, and to save you the hard part. One soon forgets the hardness in the joy. Jane was with me. We are sending no announcements to the papers, for fear you should see it on the way home. Very few people know. Our little son will be 6 weeks old when you get back. I shall be quite strong again. I hope you will be able to read this tiny writing. Nurse could only give me 1 sheet of paper. His eyes are blue. His little mouth is just like yours. I kiss it, but it does not kiss back. He is a darling, Ronnie, but he isn't you. Come back soon to your more than ever loving wife, Helen. Yes, the smudgy places are tears, but only because I am rather weak and so happy. Crossing the first page came a short postscript in firmer handwriting. After all, I am sending this to Leipzig. I daren't not tell you before you arrive. I sometimes feel as if I should have done something wrong. Tell me, directly you take me in your arms, that I did right, and that you are glad. I am down, as usual now, and baby is quite well. Aubrey's hands shook as he folded the thin paper, opened a drawer, pushed the letter far into it, and locked the drawer. Then, with set face, he turned to his own letter to Ronald West's wife. My own beloved, yes, I call you so still, because you were mine, and are mine. You threw me over, giving me no chance to prove that my love for you had made me worthy, that I would have been worthy. You sent me out into outer darkness, where there was wailing and gnashing of teeth, where the worm of remorse dies, never. But through it all, I loved you still. I love you tonight, as I never loved you before. The whole world is nothing to me excepting as the place on which you walk. I have seen the man, the selfish, self-absorbed fool, on whom you threw yourself away 6 months after you had cast me adrift. At this moment he is my guest, snoring in an adjoining room while I sit up writing to you. He has spent the evening talking of nothing but himself, his journey, his wonderful book, the strongest thing he has done yet, etc., 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 till I could have risen up and strangled him with my 2 hands. Oh, Helen, my lovely one, he is altogether unworthy of you. I saw a letter of yours long ago, in which you said he was like a young sun-god. Handsome he is, I admit. He says he has never felt fitter in his life, and he looks it. But surely a woman wants more than mere vitality and vigour and outward beauty of appearance. Heart, he has none. The wonderful news in your letter has left him unmoved. He thinks more of a 'cello he has just bought than he does of your little son. When I remonstrated with him, he rose up and struck me on the mouth. But I forgave him for your sake, and now he sleeps under my roof. Helen, he must have disappointed you over and over again. He will continue to disappoint you. Helen, you loved me once. When a woman loves once, she loves for always. Helen, if he could leave you alone during 7 months in order to get local scenery for a wretched manuscript, he will leave you alone again, and yet again. He married you for your money. He has practically admitted it to me. But now that he is making a yearly income larger than your own, he has no more use for you. Oh, my beloved, my queen, my only love, don't stay with a man who is altogether unworthy of you. If a man disappoints a woman, she has a right to leave him. He is not what she believed him to be. That fact sets her free. If you had found out, afterwards, that he was already married to another, would you not have left him? Well, he was already wedded to himself and to his career. He had no whole-hearted devotion to give to you. Helen, don't wait for his return. Directly you get this, come out here to me. Bring your little son and his nurse. My flat will be absolutely at your disposal. I can sleep elsewhere, and I swear to you I will never stay 1 moment after you bid me to go. As soon as West has set you legally free, we can marry and travel abroad for a couple of years. Then, when the whole thing has blown over, go back to live in the old house so dear to both of us. Helen, you will have 24 hours in which to get away before he returns. But even if you decide to await his return, it will not be too late. His utter self-absorption must give you a final disillusion. See if his first words to you are not about his cursed 'cello, rather than about his child and yours. If so, treat him with the silent contempt he deserves, and come at once to the man who won you first and to whom you have always belonged. Come, where tenderest consideration and the worship of a lifetime await you. Yours till death, and after, Aubrey Treherne. End of chapter 8. The Upas Tree by Florence L. Barclay. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. Chapter 9. The Pinnacle of the Temple. Aubrey's letter fell upon Helen as a crushing, stunning blow. At first her womanhood reeled beneath it. "What have I been? What have I done," she cried, "that a man dares to write thus to me?" Then her wifehood rose up in arms as she thought of Ronnie's gay, boyish trust in her, their happy life together, his joyous love and laughter. She clenched her hands. "I could kill Aubrey Treherne," she said. Then her motherhood arose, and bowing her proud head, she burst into a passion of tears. At length she stood up and walked over to the window. "It will be bad for my little son if I weep," she said, and smiled through her tears. The trees were leafless, the garden beds empty. The park looked sodden, dank, and cheerless. Summer was long dead and over, yet frosts had not begun, bringing suggestions of mistletoe and holly. But the mists were lifting, fading in white wreaths from off the grass, and, at that moment, the wintry sun, bursting through the November clouds, shone on the diamond panes, illumining the cross and the motto beneath it. "In hoc vince," murmured Helen. "As I told my own dear boy, the path of clear shining is the way to victory. In hoc signo vinces. I will take this gleam of sunlight as a token of triumph. By the help of God I will write such an answer to Aubrey as shall lead him to overcome his evil desires and bring his dark soul out into the light of repentance and confession." The same post had brought her a short letter from Ronnie, written immediately upon his arrival at Leipzig, evidently before receiving hers. It was a disappointment to have nothing more. As Aubrey had got a letter through after hearing the news, Ronnie might have done the same. But perhaps, face to face with her wonderful tidings, words had altogether failed him. He feared to spoil all he would soon be able to say by attempting to write. Tomorrow, the day which should bring him to her, would soon be here. Meanwhile her reply to Aubrey must be posted today, and his letter consigned to the flames. Feeling unable to go to the nursery with that letter unanswered, she sat down at once and wrote to her cousin. I only read your letter, Aubrey, half an hour ago. I am answering it at once because I cannot enter the presence of my little son with such a letter as yours still in my possession. As soon as I have answered it, I shall burn it. I may then be able to rise above the terrible sense of shame which completely overwhelmed me at first, at the thought that any man, above all a man who knew me well, should dare to write me such a letter. At first my whole soul cries out in horror. What am I? What have I been? What have I done, that such words should be written, such a proposition made, to me? The sin of it seemed to soil me, the burning wickedness to brand me. I seemed parted from my husband and my child, and dragged down with you into your abyss of outer darkness. Then, in my despair, sacred words were whispered for my comfort. He was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin, and, through my shame and tears, I saw a vision of the Holy One, standing serene and kingly on the pinnacle of the temple, where, though the devil dared to whisper the fiendish suggestion, "Cast thyself down," he stood his ground without a tremor, tempted, yet unsoiled. So, with this vision of my Lord before me, I take my stand, Aubrey Treherne, upon the very summit of the holy temple of wifehood and motherhood, and I say to you, get thee gone, Satan! You may have bowed my mind to the very dust in shame over your wicked words, but you cannot cause my womanhood to descend one step from off its throne. This being so, poor Aubrey, I feel able to forgive you the other great wrong, and to try to find words in which to prove to you the utter vileness of the sin, and yet to show you also the way out of your abyss of darkness and despair, into the clear shining of repentance, confession, and forgiveness. As regards the happenings of the past, between you and me, you state them wrongly. I did not love you, Aubrey, or I would never have sent you away. I could have forgiven anything to an honest man, who had merely failed and fallen. But you had lived a double life. You deceived me all along the line. I loved the man I thought you were, the man you led me to believe you were. I did not love the man I found you out to be. I could not marry a man I did not love. Therefore I sent you away. There was no question then of giving you, or not giving you, a chance to prove yourself worthy. I was not concerned just then with what you might eventually prove yourself. I did not love you, therefore I could not wed you. Though, as a side issue, it is only fair to point out, if you wish to stand upon your possible merits, that this letter, written 4 years later, confirms my then estimate of your true character. Aubrey, I cannot discuss my husband with you, nor can I bring myself to allude to the subject of my relations with him, or his with me. To defend him to you would be to degrade him in all honest eyes. To enlarge upon my love for him would be like pouring crystal water into a stagnant, polluted pool, in order to prove how pure was the fountain from which that water flowed. Nothing could be gained by such a proceeding. Pouring samples of its purity into the tainted waters of the pool would neither prove the former nor cleanse the latter. But, in order to free my own mind from the poison of your suggestions and the shame of the fact that they were made to me, I must answer, in the abstract, one statement in your letter. Please understand that I answer it completely in the abstract. You have dared to apply it to my husband and to me. I do not admit that it applies, but, even if it did, I should not let it pass unchallenged. I break a lance with you, Aubrey Treherne, and with all men of your way of thinking, on behalf of every true wife and mother in Christendom. You say that if a man has disappointed his wife, she has a right to leave him. The fact of that disappointment sets her free? I say to you, in answer, when a woman loves a man enough to wed him, he becomes as her life, her very self. I often fail, and fall, and disappoint myself. I do not thereupon immediately feel free to commit suicide. I face my failure, resolve to do better, and take up my life again, as bravely as may be, on higher lines. If a woman leaves her husband, she commits moral suicide. By virtue of his union with her, he is as her own self. If disappointment and delusion come to her through him, she must face them as she does when they come through herself. She must be patient, faithful, understanding, tender, helping him as she would help herself, to start afresh on higher ground once more, with a holy courage, facing life bravely. This is my answer, every true woman's answer, to the subtle suggestions of your letter. I admit that often marriages turn out hopeless, impossible, mere prisons of degradation. But that is when the sacred tie is entered into for other than the essential reasons of a perfect love and mutual need, or without due consideration, unadvisedly, lightly, wantonly, notwithstanding the Church's warning, or when people have found out their mistake in time, yet lacked the required courage to break their engagement, as I broke off mine with you, Aubrey, thus saving you and myself a lifetime of regret and misery. Oh, cannot you see that the only real outer darkness is the doing of wrong? Disappointment, loss, loneliness, remorse, all these must be hard to bear, but they can be borne in the light. They do not necessarily belong to the outer darkness. May I ask you, as some compensation for the pain your letter has given me, and the terrible effort this answer has cost, to bear with me if, in closing, I quote to you in full the final words of the first chapter of the Epistle of St. John. I do so with my heart full of hope and prayer for you, yes, even for you, Aubrey, because, though my words will probably fail to influence you, God has promised that his word shall never return unto him void. If we walk in the light, as he is in the light, we have fellowship one with another, and the blood of Jesus Christ, his Son, cleanses us from all sin. If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins, and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. Oh, Aubrey, act on this. It is true. Your cousin, who still hopes better things of you, and who will not fail in thought and prayer, Helen West. End of chapter 9. Of the Upas Tree by Florence L. Barclay. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by MaryAnn. Chapter 10. Ronnie arrives in a fog. Ronnie reached Liverpool Street Station at 8 o'clock on a foggy November morning. After the quiet night on the steamer, the landing in darkness at Harwich, and the steady run up to town, alone in a first-class compartment, he felt momentarily confused by the noise and movement within the great city terminus. The brilliant lights of the station, combined with the yellow fog rolling in from the various entrances, the onward rush of many feet, as hundreds of busy men and eager young women poured out of suburban trains, hurrying to the scenes which called for their energy during the whole of the coming day, the gliding in and out of trains, the passing to and fro of porters, wheeling heavy luggage, the clang of milk cans, the hoot of taxicabs, and, beyond it all, the distant roar of London, awaking and finding its way about heavily, like an angry old giant in the fog, all seemed to Ronnie to be but another of the queer nightmares which came to him now with exhausting frequency. As a rule, he found it best to wait until they passed off, so, holding the Infant of Prague in its canvas case in one hand, and the bag containing his manuscript in the other, he stood quite still upon the platform, waiting for the roar to cease, the rush to pass by, the nightmare to be over. Presently, an inspector who knew Ronnie walked down the platform. He paused at once, with the ready and attentive courtesy of the London railway official. "Any luggage, Mr. West?" he asked, lifting his cap. "No, thank you," replied Ronnie. "Not to-day." He knew he had luggage somewhere, heaps of it. But what was the good of hunting up luggage in a nightmare? Dream luggage was not worth retrieving. Besides, the more passive you are, the sooner the delusion leaves off tormenting you. "Have you come from the Hook, sir?" inquired the inspector. "Yes," said Ronnie. "Did you think I had come from the Eye?" He knew it was a vile pun, but it seemed exactly the sort of thing one says in a nightmare. The inspector laughed and passed on, then returned, looking rather searchingly at Ronnie. Ronnie thought it well to explain further. "As a matter of fact, my friend," he said, "I have come from Central Africa, where I have been sitting round camp fires, in company with asps and cockatrices and other interesting creatures. I am writing a book about it, the best thing I have done yet." The inspector had read and enjoyed all Ronnie's books. He smiled uneasily. Asps and cockatrices sounded queer company. "Won't you have a cup of coffee, sir, before going out into the fog?" he suggested. "Ah, good idea," said Ronnie, and made his way to the refreshment room. It was empty at this early hour, and quiet. All the people with rushing feet and vaguely busy faces had breakfasted at a still earlier hour in their own cosy homes. Their wives had made their coffee. Tomorrow Helen would pour out his coffee. It seemed an almost unbelievably happy thought. How came such rapture to be connected with coffee? He spent a minute or two in deciding at which of the many little marble tables he would sit. He never remembered being offered so large or so varied a choice at Liverpool Street Station before. You generally made a dash for the only empty table you saw, usually close to the door. That was like Hobson's choice, this or none. A stable of 40 good steeds, always ready and fit for travelling, but the customer must take the horse which stood nearest to the door. Well, to-day he had the run of the stable. 40 good marble tables. Which should he choose? The young woman behind the counter watched him with interest as he wandered about, carefully examining each table and sitting down tentatively at several. At last he chose the most central, as being the furthest removed from Hobson's choice, sat down, took the Infant out of its bag, and, screwing in its pointed foot, leaned it up against another chair at the table. Then he found that one of the young women had come from behind the counter, and was standing at his elbow, patiently awaiting his pleasure. He ordered a cup of coffee and a roll and butter for himself, a glass of milk and a sponge cake for the Infant. Just after these were served, before he had had time to drink the steaming hot coffee, the friendly inspector arrived, accompanied by another railway official. They said they had come to make sure Ronnie had found what he wanted in the refreshment room. Ronnie thanked them for their civility, and showed them the Infant. They looked at it with surprise and interest, but nudged one another when they noticed the glass of milk and the sponge cake which Ronnie had carefully pushed across to the Infant's side of the table. Then they saluted and went out. Left alone, Ronnie drank his coffee. It instantly cleared his brain of the after-effects of the sleeping draught which Aubrey had insisted upon giving him just before the steamer sailed the night before. His surroundings ceased to appear dreamlike. A great wave of happiness swept over him. Why, he was in London again! He was almost at home. If he had let Helen meet him, she might have been sitting just opposite, at this little marble table. He looked across and saw the unconscious Infant's glass of milk and sponge cake. He drew them hurriedly towards him. He felt suddenly ashamed of them. It was possible to carry a joke too far in public. He knew Helen would say, "Don't be silly, Ronnie." He particularly disliked milk, and was not fond of sponge cakes, but he hastily drank the one and ate the other. He could think of no other way of disposing of them. He hoped the young women, who were watching him from behind the counter, would think he enjoyed them. Then he called for a whisky and soda, to take out the exceedingly beastly taste of the milk, but instantly remembered that old Dick had said, "Touch no alcohol," so changed the order to another cup of coffee. This second instalment of coffee made him feel extraordinarily fit and vigorous. He put the Infant back into its bag. The inspector returned. "We have found your luggage, Mr. West," he said. "If we may have your keys, we can get it out for you." "Ah, do," said Ronnie. "Many thanks. Put it in a taxi. I shall leave it at my club. I am afraid I was rather vague about it just now, but I had been given a sleeping draught on board, and was hardly awake when I got out of the train. I am all right now. Thanks for your help, my good fellow." The inspector looked relieved. Ronnie paid his bill, took up the 'cello, handed his bag to the inspector, and marched off gaily to claim his luggage. He felt like conquering the world. The fog was lifting. The roar of the city sounded more natural. He had an excellent report to make to his publisher, heaps of copy to show him, and then he was going home to Helen. In the taxi he placed the Infant on the seat beside him. On the whole he felt glad he had told Helen not to meet him at the station. It was so much more convenient to have plenty of room in the taxi for his 'cello. It stood so safely in the seat beside him in its canvas bag. As they sped westward, he enjoyed looking out at the fog and mud and general wintry aspect of London. He did not feel cold. Aubrey had persuaded him to buy a magnificent fur coat at the Hague. He had lived in it ever since, feeling gorgeous and cosy. Aubrey's ideas of spending money suited him better than Helen's. His taxi glided rapidly along the greasy embankment. Once it skidded on the tram lines, and Ronnie laid a steadying hand upon the 'cello. The grey old Thames went rolling by, mighty, resistless, perpetually useful, right through the heart of busy London. Ronnie thought of the well-meaning preacher who pointed out to his congregation, as an instance of the wonderful overrulings of an all-wise Providence, the fact that large rivers flowed through great cities, and small streams through little villages. Ronnie laughed very much at the recollection of this story, and tried to remember whether he had ever told it to Helen. Arrived at his club, he shaved, tubbed, changed his clothes, and, leaving his 'cello in charge of the hall porter, sallied out with his manuscript to call upon his publisher. In his portmanteau he had found Dr. Dick's bottle of stuff to take on the journey. Aubrey had persuaded him to pack it away. He now took a dose, then slipped the bottle into the pocket of his fur coat. All went well during the rest of the morning. His publisher was neither preoccupied nor vague. He gave Ronnie a great reception and his full attention. In the best of spirits, and looking the bronzed picture of perfect health, Ronnie returned to his club, lunched, showed his 'cello to 2 or 3 friends, then caught the 3 o'clock train to Hollymead. The 7 months were over. All nightmares seemed to have cleared away. He was on his way to Helen. In half an hour he would be with her. He began to wonder, eagerly, what Helen would say to the infant. He felt quite sure that as soon as he got the bow in his hand, and the 'cello between his knees, the infant would have plenty to say to Helen. He had kept his yearning to play under strong control so that she might be there to enjoy with him the wonderful experience of those first moments. As the train slowed up for Hollymead, and the signal lights of the little wayside station appeared, Ronnie took the last dose of Dick's physic, and threw the bottle under the seat. End of chapter 10.